Well, thank you again for listening to the Trainer Trainer podcast. And this time I have a conversation with Dr. Martin Greenberg. He is a retired hand and trauma orthopedic surgeon with over 40 years in medicine and 24 years in law enforcement. A former police officer, SWAT operator, tactical medic, and police medical director, he pioneered tactical emergency medical support in Illinois. How do you spell that? Illinois?
Illinois is our state.
Sorry, yeah, it is the state, yeah. Where over half of SWAT teams now have embedded TEMS units. As an IMERT Executive Council member, Dr. Greenberg has thought extensively on emergency response and co-authored the Law Enforcement Medical Encyclopedia. And I first came on your work because you wrote a great article in Mind Over Matter, How Your Mindset Affects Performance Under Stress on For Science. So great to talk to you, and we're going to talk
Okay.
about a unified theory about stress and decision making. But can you give first a little bit of information? How did you move from being a doctor to a police officer, and why?
Well, I was an orthopedic trauma and hand surgeon for 20 years when the Columbine incident occurred in 1999. And it struck me at that time that we were not handling these active shooter incidents correctly. We were actually enabling them by creating an outer perimeter and isolating them where the active shooters were then able to continue their work. So that made me become interested in providing medical care inside an inner perimeter of a tactical incident, which isn't permitted through our EMS protocols. And the development of this kind of embryonic area of medicine took years to develop at that point. I eventually, though, had to become a police officer, a certified SWAT operator, a tactical medic, and a police medical director to further the cause of tactical medicine inside inner perimeters locally in my area in Illinois and nationally. And now tactical medicine is recognized as an actual medical specialty with a license to practice. And over half the SWAT teams in our local area and in our country, and even I would say internationally, have embedded trained medical teams to provide medical care during that critical golden hour of trauma that we talk about.
Yeah.
And so that led me into working on law enforcement medical training, including field medical care, and led me into meeting the folks at Force Science, including Dr. Bill Lewinsky. And the idea of the psychological training of police officers to bring modern psychological training principles into law enforcement where they really had not occurred, where losing means dying, was really critical. So I directed my attention towards that, and that basically led to teaching the medical aspects of how we think and make decisions in their certification course. And then this white paper, which is hopefully the scientific basis for discussing rapid decision making and how we can optimize it, and why it's even important to understand what's happening in our bodies to prime us for successful resolution of our rapid decisions, or the opposite. And that's what led to this discussion here.
Yeah, great. And before we go into that white paper, can you give a little bit insight in you were moving from being a medic, being a doctor, to in law enforcement. I spoke with a lot of medical specialists throughout the years, and also a lot of law enforcement. And what did you learn from the work as a doctor that you could apply in law enforcement?
Well, basically, it's providing good medicine in bad places. So we feel that having high quality medical care inside our inner perimeter was key, and that our law enforcement community was basically underappreciated, underrespected, underpaid, and were denied the basic societal commitment of providing medical care that everyone else outside that perimeter was allowed. So that was our motivation to give our law enforcement community this high quality medical care on the spot when they needed it in an emergency, as well as bystanders and even perpetrators.
Yeah, maybe you know Michael Loria. He is a former pararescue jumper, and he later on became a paramedic. And he did a lot of tactical medicine in the military, in your military. Yeah? I think yeah. So tactical medicine, it was already, I think, in the military, isn't it?
Yes, a lot of the uh, tenets of military medicine have now been combined with civilian medicine, and really, and vice versa, so that the military now trains with SWAT teams, for example, to learn how to actively successfully perform in urban environments, for example. Civilian law enforcement has learned to deal with military concepts. Advancements made on the battlefield in military medicine have always kind of leached their way into civilian medical care, including vascular injury care, neural injury care, and it really is a reciprocal knowledge experience we've got going on.
And when you talk about tactical medicine, does that mean that the operator, for example, in police or in SWAT team, is doing two jobs at the same time? That's law enforcement and medical?
Uh, well, we feel that a doctor or a tactical medicine provider, which is frequently a paramedic,
Mm-hmm.
needs to understand the tactical or law enforcement aspects of what he's doing, so as not to be a liability to an incident, right? And not to do things like create a dangerous situation, not to do things like destroy evidence, uh, and when it's appropriate or not appropriate for him to even render medical care in those situations. Is he able to defend himself in an emergency, which is unpredictable? So that when we were formulating the idea of active shooter response, contact, and rescue teams, for example, the rescue team, which would include medical providers inside an inner perimeter, could easily become the contact team should a perpetrator encounter a rescue team. So how will we respond in that situation? So that's why law enforcement training was kind of critical for medical providers in those situations.
Yeah, great. And for all my friends, also in the States, the medical specialists, they are also very curious about, for example, what protocol is used in emergency situations. Sometimes we hear about the March protocol or the ABCD. Are there some?
Right. I think that the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Committee, called TCCC, is a national committee made up of a combination of military and law enforcement providers that have had some basic plans to treat, perform field medical care. And we try to adhere to those rules. I think that sticking to rigid algorithms is probably never a good idea in complex changing situations, and that frequently algorithms are provided to let us perform in situations without always thinking about the situation itself. And I think that can be bad. But understanding the basic concepts of field medical care and really what is going on physiologically is very important. And that's also true in terms of our discussion of rapid decision making. Yeah. So, why is it even important to know what's going on inside your head or hormonally or physiologically during these situations? And the reason is that we can change our training to optimize those functions that are occurring within us to allow us to optimally perform.
Yeah.
And so that even things that don't seem to have a psychological basis in our performance actually do. So as an orthopedic trauma surgeon, you'd think this is one of the most objective surgical specialties where we're measuring things and cutting things and dealing with angles and so forth. Well, really, half of the decisions of what to do and how to recover from these musculoskeletal injuries really are mental decisions.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing is also true in law enforcement training. And now that we are making the kind of slow transition to learning these modern psychological principles in academy training in law enforcement and ongoing training, survival has definitely improved. An example of using these psychological or physiological principles in law enforcement training is the U.S. Marshal Service. The idea of using scenario training as a fundamental part of training at the speed of life, in other words, rather than block and silo training where we sit in a classroom, get a week's worth of instruction on whatever the topic is, take our test on Friday afternoon, feel good about it. But by Saturday, we've forgotten 25% of what we learned, even just that previous week. Yeah. 6 months later, we remember less than half of what we learned. And then we're giving people guns and badges after they graduate from the academy and expecting them to go out and really solve the world's problems as experts, when in fact, their training is only slightly better than what a novice would never have been trained at all. And so that is grossly unfair to them and to society as well. So by training differently, we retain important information, and then we are able to actively and think in an more expert manner of how to respond when a critical incident occurs.
So, and then you wrote an article on the For Science site about the mindset, about the threat or challenge mindset, but you also wrote a white paper, or you're busy with a white paper, and this is about, if I'm correct, about a unified theory of stress and decision making. Is that correct?
Correct. The article that appeared in For Science News was really just these very superficial summary or really kind of teaser article or explanation for the white paper, which is a bit wonky in terms of the scientific explanation of all these processes, because it's the scientific explanation of what Force Science is trying to teach in terms of rapid decision making. It is a little bit it can be a little bit confusing talking about things like the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, all the hormones that are affecting us, how our heart responds to autonomic or automatic nervous system control, and why that's important, and how that correlates with our thought processes, and how they stimulate all these physiological and neurological things to happen in coordination with each other. And so the white paper is basically done, and we can discuss it here if you like.
Yeah, great.
But I apologize. I apologize if it seems a little bit disconnected at times when we talk about these separate areas, but then hopefully we'll see why it's so important in terms of training and really in terms of survival. And so when they asked me to do this, Dr. Lewinsky said he wanted to give officers and trainers everything they needed to, quote, safely go through the door, unquote. Well, going safely through the door might be the door of a warrant service, a search warrant, or later on, the door of a courtroom to explain why you did what you did, and why that's so important. So we wanted to correlate this to protect officers in both those situations. And so we wanted to explain human physiological reactions to stress, talk about an accepted theory regarding making decisions under stress, and basically by correlating them, make it safer for officers and the public. So when we talk about this, we wonder why is it even important to talk about these different topics? So we have a parable of the blind men and the elephant, and I'm sure we've all heard this. It goes back to even Hindu texts, and to paraphrase it, there are a bunch of blind men, and they are standing around an elephant, and they each are tasked with describing what it is that we have in front of us. So they're blind, and each one feels a different part of the elephant. And so the elephant is described as a snake, a pillar, a fan, a rope, a wall, or a spear. And had each man been exposed to more parts of the animal, they would have had a more complete understanding of it. And that understanding, though, depending on how many parts they could feel, would still only approximate what the elephant was. But that's the way it is with stressful decision making. It's seemingly diverse elements are all very interdependent and interactive. And so that the psychological elements, for example, both guide and are guided by behavioral elements. Mm-hmm. So they're guided by their anatomic, neural, hormonal components that together interact to obtain an outcome. So like in the parable, although each element of stressful decision-making was previously possibly explored, but in the parable, their unified function has to be considered to really understand that, or to really see the elephant. And that's the goal of what we're trying to discuss here.
Yeah, great.
And so our federal law enforcement training center, which we call FLETC, used the OODA loop to basically use this as a way to frame and conceptualize the decision-making process. So possibly we can discuss that first.
Yeah, great.
So the OODA loop, we've probably heard of this internationally, I'm sure, was a theory formulated by Colonel John Boyd. So he was an Air Force colonel, and he wasn't a prolific writer, but he had very long Air Force briefings where he described his theory. And basically, the 4 steps of the OODA loop that we are all familiar with are observe, orient, decide, and act. But frequently, we just toss them around in a very superficial way. Colonel Boyd was known as 42nd Boyd, so he had a standing bet that he could maneuver his plane into a winning dogfighting position in 40 seconds using his theory. And he reportedly never lost a bet. So what he was describing was really a learning system that we're all kind of neurologically hardwired to use in any rapidly changing environment. And so actually dogfighting was that kind of environment, right? He understood that we live in a very ambiguous world, which we can only incompletely understand. And he used the term mental concepts or schema to describe the way we adjust to the current situation we find ourselves in, like we're in a play that we hope will have a successful ending, so that experts in these situations have successful goal-oriented schema, but novices don't. And even the best schema have to be able to constantly change to remain effective. And Boyd even went into physics talking about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which said that any schema has to be constantly updated to remain current. He talked about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle that stated that we can never really understand reality because we can't measure all aspects of it, like our elephant. And even talked about the second law of thermodynamics, which stated that the universe is in a state of increasing disorder. So basically, he was trying to interpret this to mean that things around us are constantly changing. And to the extent that our ideas of what's happening are closed or fixed, they won't be capable of updating to this constantly changing reality, so that the 4-step process has to be constantly modified and repeated as in a loop. And to do this, we use our schema or natural decision making, which we're going to discuss, and then new information. So decisions that we make.
Can I ask you one thing, Martin, about
Sure.
the schemas? Because there is a lot of talk today about the ecological approach to perception and action and so on, where there is less talked about cognition and so on. But by schemas, do you mean cognitive structures? And more specifically, do you mean long-term memory where experience are stored?
I think both of those things. Gary Klein, who formulated natural decision-making theory, which we constantly talk about, described schemas as like prior experiences we have in our long-term memory that under stress pop up as the best reaction to the problem we're facing. Unlike looking at something in an Aristotelian relaxed manner where every option is discussed and accepted or rejected, Dr. Klein felt, and so did Colonel Boyd, that our initial idea of what worked for us in the past will pop into our heads, and then we will modify it slightly to our current situation and use that. And he said that this mostly occurs in the observation, in the orientation step of our OODA loop, where we are using our understanding of our surroundings, which hopefully will be good, to make this decision. And and if we're experts, of course, we're going to understand what important cues are out in the environment versus the novice who will be overwhelmed with unimportant cues that he won't be able to interpret.
Yeah.
And so this leads us into the whole discussion of game theory and being goal-oriented, and because we're experts, understanding what cues we should be paying attention to and what cues are unimportant. So that is occurring in our orientation stage of our OODA loop. So can expert pre-existing schema cause expert observations, or vice versa? Is it the chicken or is it the egg? But Boyd understood that being able to modify these schema based upon new information was mandatory. And he even used the term destructive deduction and creative induction to describe that process.
Can you explain that?
Yes, that we have schema, but we're constantly modifying them, and new actions can result because of the on-the-spot modifications from one loop blending into the next loop. And our director of learning, Mike Masengo at Force Science, discussed a similar situation he was in, whereas he was the team leader in a SWAT call out. He was in the basement with his team, and they started getting fire from an unknown location in the basement. And he described like holding his AR-15 in a new way he had never done before, and firing it in a way he had never done before, for which he was not even consciously aware, in order to solve the problem. And so that was an example of destructive deduction and creative induction, modifying his OODA loop. So that was an example of the OODA loop and its ability to modify. And of course, the decision process in the OODA loop has to be very straightforward, right? So a famous Chicago police inspector said that you have to know the law, what you can do, and be able to do it immediately. And if you delay, of course, in the situation where having a faster OODA loop than your opponent usually means winning, the results of delay can be fatal, but also you need to decide whether de-escalation or disengagement at that point might be important if your reaction to a situation can't possibly beat somebody's action. And then, of course, this blends into the next step, or to act. So to act is to test your plan, and that will modify, as we said, into the next OODA loop. We know that many hours of training are necessary to be able to act like an expert in different sporting fields. Some people used to say 40,000 hours of training or 10 years of training, and that may not be true, but very long periods of time. So can we short circuit this by giving people expert schema through scenario training and through scenario trainers like Virtra, for example, to short circuit their 10-year process of learning how to be an expert by giving them expert schema, hardwiring that into their brain with doing multiple reps of expert responses to common tactical situations, and combining that with learning how to automatically respond with a technical action. So that's the act phase of the OODA loop. So Paul Howe from Black Hawk Down fame also felt that the act part of the OODA loop was the most important part. Boyd thought that the orientation part was the most important part. But if you can act in a mindless manner to effectively perform your technical skill, like making a precision shot, you're able to direct your limited amount of attention to externally to important general and specific environmental cues that'll let you then function more efficiently. Robert Nidefer is a psychologist who talked about our quadrants of attention.
Yeah.
And so there are 4 quadrants: our internal, general and specific quadrants of attention, and external. So if we can free our internal attention by performing something in an automatic way, which doesn't require using our attention on that, and direct all of it outwardly, we'll be able to be more effective.
Is this a stimulus response training, operant
Well,
conditioning?
it's learning to perform any automatic function like shooting in a manner where we do not have to pay any attention to the technical aspects of it. So in other words, if I was a novice shooting, I might say, how's my breathing? What's my stance like? What about my trigger pull? How about my sight alignment? And that would basically distract me from using my limited amount of attention, which we've all got, to the external important things I should be paying attention to in order to win in that situation. And so that's where automaticity comes into play. So if we can combine automaticity, which Dr. Mann and others have described as the Bereitschafts potential, then we have that extra amount of attention we can then use in important external ways. Bill Lewinsky and others have discussed the type of decision we make under stress as satisficing, or satisfying and sacrificing. So it's not the perfect answer that we might come up with if we had hours of sitting in our easy chair with a beer to decide what we would retrospectively do, but it's a pretty good answer that we're using on the spot, maybe not perfect. And then that satisficed approach will then be modified in our next OODA loop. So we've all seen the movie with Tom Cruise, where he is in a plane and he's teaching how dogfighting to his students. Top Gun Maverick, very popular movie in the last year or two, and so he then is able to shoot his plane vertically between his 2 students, confusing them, getting into the proper dogfighting position, and shooting them both, down in training. And so that's an example of disrupting your opponent's OODA loop, because your OODA loop is working faster and more efficiently. So the idea is that how can we understand that and train that more efficiently in our students? And this kind of also gets into the discussion, which we'll talk about a little more in a short time, about the quiet eye. Mm-hmm. That's been a big topic lately, and it was basically discovered by Dr. Joan Vickers, who's a research psychologist in Canada, and she was basically a sports psychologist. So that basically linked visual motor performance under stress with kind of the young and burgeoning field of brain and eye neuroanatomy. And so to do that, to understand that, we really need to understand the anatomy of sight and what happens to our body under stress. So to talk about what happens under stress, we should first define it. And so we can say that stress is just outside forces affecting individuals. And although we think of stress as a negative factor, it's the factor that's driving natural selection, and basically, as the most adaptable creature on the planet, man has used stress to be at the top of the food chain. Historically, Claude Bernard, a French physiologist, described the milieu intérieur, and which was a hemostasis in our body that we are trying to always successfully maintain. The neurologist Walter Cannon described homeostasis to talk about this relationship, and talked about emotional stressors, flight or fight. He discovered norepinephrine or noradrenaline, which is secreted from the medullary part of the adrenal gland, and that's responsible for critical incident responses that we talk about, like tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, tachypsychia, slowing of time, perception that we've heard about for so many years. Hans Selye, another famous physiologist, talked about the pituitary, the master gland, and the hormone cortisol, which is secreted by the adrenal gland. And he, again, coined the term stress, and he had experiments where he placed rats under stress, and these rats had adrenal gland enlargement, ulcers, gastrointestinal ulcers, degraded immune systems, and he called that the stress syndrome, which is very similar to things we see in tactical officers exposed to too much prolonged stress. So, really, what's going on in our nervous system to cause this problem? Well, the hardware mediating it includes the interaction of the sympathetic nervous system, part of the autonomic nervous system, the automatic nervous system, and the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which we call the HPA axis. So the sympathetic nervous system releases adrenaline or norepinephrine when triggered by an area of the brain that we term the locus ceruleus. And the locus ceruleus is part of our brain called the limbic system, which is responsible for emotional reactions. It's a little bit poorly understood. But within the HPA axis, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called corticotrophin releasing factor that travels through your blood to the pituitary, where it causes the release of another hormone, adrenocorticotrophic hormone, or ACTH. That travels through your blood similarly to the adrenal cortex to release the stress hormone cortisol that we've all heard about, which is a steroid that causes the stress response. A feedback loop then can occur normally in the presence of high cortisol levels to cause the pituitary to shut down its ACTH production, moderate cortisol levels, and lower the stress response. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, norepinephrine is released, controlling automatic functions like heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, cardiac output, and peripheral vascular resistance, which can all be measured. And it turns out that increased heart rate can actually occur in either good stress or bad stress, so that a high heart rate these days isn't necessarily a problem, which is something we thought was a problem until the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Our locus ceruleus and our emotional centers, including an area called the amygdala, can modify our stress response by helping us determine whether a situation is really threatening or not threatening. So a mother a mother at night can sleep through trains going by outside our window, but when our baby cries, she immediately wakes up. So our thalamus is filtering these things and performing in milliseconds evaluations of their threatening or non-threatening nature. And even psychologist Daniel Kahneman talked about our System 1 and System 2 in his multiple books, but Sources of Power might be the best one, where he says that we are constantly, like on a subconscious level, evaluating our environment and filtering out all this information that's coming in as, is it dangerous or isn't it dangerous? And we're actually reacting with our sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system unconsciously to all these responses. And if it becomes serious enough, then we can consciously appreciate something's going on and then respond to it, which he calls System 2. So we have this unconscious, constant system going on versus our conscious system going on, but the unconscious system is always working. And so
what is the influence of experiences? And I asked that also personally on my own behalf, because I had a very troubled and violent youth, and later on came into police and so on, and saw a lot of other bad things. And I have the impression that my nervous system and all those brain structures are a little bit on high alert most of the time. And I find
100%.
Yeah.
A person's individual genetics and even their experience in the womb can be affected by maternal trauma. So they've shown in their rat experiments, for example, that mothers who were placed under chronic stress had baby rats when they grew up that also acted as though they were under stress all the time, and it had these same problems with their immune system and hyperreactivity that other baby rats whose mothers didn't have that experience didn't have that problem. So it's definitely something that can be a little bit genetic, but it's something that can also be trained and controlled through the combination of expert schema training and automaticity.
So do you think you can say that these are structural changes in the brain, for example, in my brain? Do you think you can overwrite these schemes that they become more, how do you call it, more mature and more relaxed? Do you think that's possible?
Yes. Well, now we basically think that your brain is constantly changing, and that your brain structurally is a result of your actual thought processes. And if you're trained to think in a cognitive manner versus in an emotional manner, which I think we'd like to discuss in a few minutes, you will learn to use these expert schema in other related but not exactly related situations you find yourself. And so short-circuiting novice training with expert schema through things like VirTra, and you're probably familiar with VirTra.
Yeah, I talked with Lon Bartel, but can you
yes,
can you explain what he does?
Well, he is the director of training, and he is talking about quality, high fidelity training that's correct or mimics actual reality in a physical and a psychological way, so that he's presenting schema in any particular situation through his scenario trainings that are very close to reality and teaches people how to respond in that situation, which they can use on the street in similar situations and solve in an expert manner, rather than as a novice, which might go wrong. And so the high fidelity training should be of a physical level where it gets your heart rate and all your autonomic responses up to what they would be if you were actually in such a situation, as close as possible, and psychologically to make you think the way you would think in such a situation. And so they can use this high fidelity training to actually simulate real life training at the speed of life, and that can actually improve the retention of information by 30 to 50% compared to block and silo training. So incorporating that kind of training into the police academy and into post-academy training is crucial, and is one of the recommendations Force Science makes in modern psychological training principles. So
you talked about stress and the sympathetic and neural effects and mechanisms.
Right. So our autonomic nervous system is our peripheral nervous system. In other words, not really in our brains, right? Our peripheral nervous system, and is comprised of the sympathetic and parasympathetic components, right? So the sympathetic nervous system that we talked about prepares our body for stressful reactions. It increases our heart rate, increases our pulse, our blood pressure, decreases our peripheral vascular resistance, so we get better blood supply to our major muscle groups. It shuts down our gut. And its neurotransmitter is norepinephrine or noradrenaline. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, does the opposite. So it's kind of calming us down. It slows our heart rate. It can slow our heart rate. It decreases our cardiac output. It can lower our blood pressure. It increases our total peripheral vascular resistance. So now blood that was going to our major muscle groups is going to, let's say, our gut for eating and other functions. And so there is an interaction of these two systems that are constantly going on in our body, and that our response in any situation is sort of a balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation. It's not purely one or purely the other. And there are even in our heart other feedback mechanisms besides these neural ones called reflex arcs that can be basically baroreceptors in our heart. So if our heart starts pumping too much, pressure receptors will change it. There are chemoreceptors in our heart that are functioning things like our pH level in our blood, how acid it is, or what is the CO2 level in our blood, to also modulate these responses to try and keep them within a safe level. But how does our nervous system control all these things? And this is where we should probably discuss our dorsal and ventral attention pathways and how they make us think one way or another, either cognitively or emotionally, and how they might stimulate our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems to get everything going at the physiologic level. And so after our visual information leaves our eyes, gets into our optic nerves, it travels through optic radiations, which are like little railroad track nerves that go to the back of our brain, to an area called the occipital lobe. So our brain has 4 lobes that each control different aspects of our survival. And the occipital lobe in the back of our brain controls our visual performance, right? So the information will then get back into our occipital lobe. And in the last 30 years or so, we've been able to define multiple levels or filters in our occipital lobe that filters this information. And there are actually 5 areas, V1 through V5, we call them, in our occipital lobe that filter our visual information stream. And some of these areas direct data to the dorsal part of our brain, the dorsal and parietal lobes, but the top parts, and we call that the dorsal stream or dorsal attention network. And those are the areas of our brain involved with cognitive decisions. Other areas direct attention or information to the temporal lobes and frontal lobes. And the temporal lobe is responsible for our emotional response, and that's more in the bottom of the brain. So we call that our ventral attention network or ventral processing network. So the dorsal stream or dorsal attention network is responsible for orientation, for gaze and attention, which again, Colonel Boyd would call our orientation, our observation and orientation phase of the OODA loop. And we call it the where pathway because it's kind of a master map of where we are in our environment. And updates this topographical information, let's say, to us. The ventral stream is handling sudden anticipation and planning, and it involves our emotional responses. And that's primarily regulated down there by the amygdala. We call it the what pathway. So are we hearing hoofbeats of a razorback tiger or our dog? So do we get upset or not? So that's part of really our system 1 that's going on all the time with our constant filtering of this information. So the dorsal stream can respond very quickly to information. The ventral stream is slow. Data then will then pass from those streams into the parietal lobes or the somatosensory cortex, where all the touch-related sensations are processed, and then it goes into the frontal lobes. That's where our decisions are made. So in the frontal area, we have the prefrontal cortex, which plans movements. And then data goes into the premotor cortex to organize motion, and then into the motor cortex to initiate movement. And so what I've just described to you as an anatomic pathway is what Colonel Boyd was talking about with his observe, orient, decide, and act. So it's kind of amazing that, 40 years after Colonel Boyd described what he was seeing actually happening, the actual neuroanatomic areas have been mapped out in the brain that actually correspond to those 4 steps, which is
great.
Pretty incredible, right?
Yeah.
But how can that help us understand what contributes to all this sustained appropriate attention that experts in sports or law enforcement demonstrate that we're interested in developing? So a lot of studies have been done psychologically using medical imaging like positron emission tomography, the PET scan, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, during attention studies. And it was shown that during times of focused attention, the dorsal attention network is actively functioning because it's lighting up those structures on the PET scan, and functional MRI is showing, oh, that's working as well. And at the same time, the ventral attention network is being suppressed. And this was was used by Dr. Vickers using also eye tracking glasses, which let you actually see what someone is actually looking at, and to show that experts are looking at important things for longer periods of time while all these parts of the brain are being activated and the ventral parts are being suppressed, while novices are not. And so that is what she calls the quiet eye phenomenon. So the definition that she made was that it's the final fixation or tracking gaze within 3 degrees of visual angle, which means the fovea of your eye, like the center of your retina, which has the most cones and sees the most clearly, is the area that you're focusing on, which she's measuring, for a minimum of 100 milliseconds. So if you're focusing with all your best vision for 100 milliseconds or more on this thing, that's the quiet eye. And that has been demonstrated in experts to last longer than in novices. And she feels that that goes along with expert performance. So I don't know if you've participated in athletics, where sometimes in athletics you may have performed like way better than you ever expected, where you felt, quote, in the zone, where you weren't worried about anything, where you weren't thinking about your technical performance of whatever the sport was, but yet you were able to perform better than ever before. And there seemed to be no pressure to succeed at those times. Well, I was a competitive shooter in high school and college, and so I experienced that sensation of not worrying about anything, but really doing great. But then I've also been in situations where I was very anxious and concerned about how I was going to do, and then I was more emotional and didn't do well at all. So in sports, and in law enforcement too, we call poor performance due to anxiety choking. And so choking.
Martin, can I give you a hypothesis about what you're saying now? Because
Sure.
maybe you can say if it's right. If I understand you correctly, if I am focusing externally through the quiet eye, for example, then my dorsal pathway is active, and my ventral pathway is suppressed, so that I'm not as emotional. Yes. So I can regulate. Maybe what I'm saying is I can regulate my emotions by external focus of attention.
Right. By being able to think cognitively. And using that, we call it a top-down pathway because it's in the top of your brain, your dorsal attention network, by focusing on important cues and learning in expert scenario what those important cues are. What in the environment should I be looking at, right? When I want to see a perpetrator's hands so they don't shoot me rather than just say police. I'm focusing on something important. When I look at the environment as a police officer and I'm looking at windows through which someone can shoot me versus just all over the place, I'm focusing on important things that then will, possibly affect my survival. And I'm learning to look for those important things. I'm thinking cognitively. My ventral emotional pathway is being suppressed at the same time. And I'm functioning more using this quiet eye as an expert in order to succeed.
Why do you say thinking cognitively? Because thinking is thinking not cognitive anyway.
Well, you can have emotional, distracted thought, or
Okay.
you can have goal-oriented, focused cognitive thought. And so what explains what we look at as a challenge or a threat? So this is kind of getting into our discussion of challenge versus threat, which is really talking about why we choke or we don't choke. And so the psychological theory to discuss this is basically the biopsychosocial model of challenge and threat, which we call the BPM theory. So how do you decide what a challenge or a threat is? So this involves making a psychological determination of, can something hurt you, and should it be avoided or used to your benefit? And your reaction, if you think you have high resources to meet this threat, whatever it is, and there are low demands, meaning you'll probably succeed because you've got it organized, then you look at it as a challenge. And if you look at it as a challenge, your dorsal attention network pathway, your top-down thinking will be stimulated, and your physiologic response using your sympathetic nervous system, for example, that we've discussed, will be activated, and you'll be more likely to be able to manage the problem. Whereas if you feel that you have low resources to meet the problem, but there are high demands, and you're feeling kind of overwhelmed by the situation, then your ventral pathway is taking over and emotional responses occur. You don't think cognitively, and your parasympathetic nervous system is getting activated, which then prepares you to cut and run rather than succeed and meet the challenge.
Is this the same as self-confidence? If self-confidence, yes, does that mean I believe that I have the resources to deal with the challenge?
Call it the biopsychosocial model, because it not only depends upon your physiology, but it depends upon your expert schema, your training, your abilities, and your external support. So your intelligence that you've got about the situation, your gear, who's there to help you out, is backup coming, and are all these external support networks present? And this all goes into your assessment of if you have the necessary resources or not. So they're internal resources and external resources, and they're all being taken into consideration. And this will affect you physiologically. So in the threat state, even though your pulse rate may be elevated, your body's being prepared to meet a threat, but also for inhibition should you have to abandon your goal and escape. And you can measure these challenge or threat responses that our body is making by measuring things like cardiac output, by measuring things like total peripheral vascular resistance. So it's not just like your subjective response of, oh, I feel challenged or I feel threatened, but here are functional, objective, measurable things that we can look at to see, well, where are you on the spectrum? Because it really turns out that we are all always challenged and threatened simultaneously in any stressful situation we find ourselves in. And then where are we on this like teeter-totter of balance of assessment will determine which way we go and which way our bodies go physiologically to either help us think better and act better versus emotional distracted performance. So I told you I was an orthopedic trauma and hand surgeon for 40 years. And so when I had to go deal with a terrible trauma, let's say someone's hand that was crushed and all their little carpal bones were separated from each other and mixed up like a bag of marbles in their hand. And I had to figure out, well, where do they all fit without ever, let's say, having seen them connect, totally disconnected before, like a puzzle. I would be really worried. Oh, I don't know if I can do this. What's going to happen if I don't? Oh, this is terrible. And so that was my emotional ventral attention network acting. But then on the other hand, I thought, well, I'm the only guy here. And if I can't do it, it won't get done. And I just have to do it somehow. So I just better think about what I have to do to put these bones together the right way so that I can save this gentleman's hand. So there I'm thinking cognitively, my dorsal attention network's going, and it's really sort of a little battle going on by my continuing assessments of the situation. Do I have the resources I need to put these bones together or not? Or am I going to flop?
Can you fake it? For example, say that I was in your situation and I am not a surgeon, but I tell myself I'm the only man here to do the job, but I have no I have no skills. I have nothing. Can I fake it?
Well, your assessment or your belief in your ability to succeed or not succeed is a critical factor in your challenge mode. But there's the expression being strong but wrong, where you might think that, but then reality may impose itself upon you, and it may turn out that wasn't correct. But then your OODA loop, if you survive, will have to correct you on the next loop around. But I mean, your assessment of it, your psychological impression is the key component that's based upon all these things, and some of these assessments, if the more expert they are, the more accurate they will be based upon like actual reality. But if you think I can't win, then you won't win. You'll be thinking emotionally and you won't perform well. Where if you think I can win, but based upon all these other assessments we talked about, hopefully based in, objective reality, ultimately, will put you in a much better position to cognitively meet your challenge. And so even the people you deal with, if they're supportive of you, will make you feel more challenged and less threatened.
But it's not just positive self-talk, isn't it?
No, well, that's a component of it, but that positive self-talk has to also be placed, rooted in actual training.
Yes, exactly.
And in actual knowledge and in actual expert schema that in actual reality will actually work or not work. So you don't want to be strong but wrong. You want to be strong but right. And so you by developing expert schema and by developing automaticity, you're going down, the correct path. But but not just thinking I know everything without actually knowing or doing anything to further that position is going to ultimately not work. So what we were saying then, and even looking at EEGs, which they've done, electroencephalograms during these studies have also shown us how these processes, are coordinated. So we look at 4 wave functions in the EEG, but the wave function that we look at that is involved in cognitive thought is the theta wave. And the theta wave is 4 to 7 hertz. And it's been shown that the theta wave during times of focused attention in these studies is initiated when they look at EEGs and PET scans combined in the anterior cingulate gyrus and mid-frontal cortex area. So those areas which are in our top-down pathway that we've now talked about stimulate theta wave production. And this is all kind of a hub-like response because those areas are sort of in the center of your brain. So now the theta waves are moving throughout your brain, and we think that they are helping to then coordinate further cognitive responses and successful motor coordination. And so it also shows that decreased EEG activity in the temporal lobes occurs at these times, which is our ventral pathway that's actually being suppressed. So is it a battle in your brain between your dorsal and ventral attention networks during times of concentrated thought? And probably the answer is yes, that normally they function congruently in just daily life, but when it gets down to this one situation where you're making a stressful decision, you're under stress, to be successful, your cognitive network needs to take over if you were an expert, and your ventral network needs to be suppressed. So is the theta wave the director of your neural orchestra or not? It's hard to say. Are expert schema responsible for a long QE interval? Is the expert QE interval activating the dorsal attention network? And really, we're at the beginning of these discoveries and understandings now that will definitely grow in the next 30 years. But even now we know that the expert QE interval, expert scenario schema training, as in VirTra, and the use of automaticity will definitely further all these important physiological responses that we want. And talking a little bit more about choking, the other psychological theory that's kind of important to know about is the attentional control theory. And the attentional control theory also feels that you have two competing networks, the dorsal and ventral networks, the challenge and threat networks, but that our working memory or short-term memory is affected by cognitive anxiety. And our short-term memory does a bunch of things, but one important thing is that it inhibits it inhibits our attention from being misdirected to unimportant cues and keeps it directed towards important cues. So when we are more anxious, we have more difficulty in focusing on the important things. And so we talk about psychological studies to have proven this. And so tests called the Stroop test, STROOP test, is a test where people who were either anxious or not anxious were asked to measure objects based upon neutral or threatening characteristics. And anxious people couldn't do as well. And that we look at their saccades, or how their eyes are shifting back and forth from one thing to another. They know what important things they're supposed to pay attention to, and they know in advance what the unimportant things are. But yet, if they're anxious, their saccades increase dramatically, so that they can't keep themselves from looking at the unimportant things if they're anxious versus the important things. And this is something that Force Science has documented in their studies of these force the eyeglass studies, right? So a study called the MESA study was one study where they did this, and it turns out that experts who did well in their scenarios tactically had lower saccades and were able to look longer with a QE interval at the important things they had to look at in order to do well, including returning gunfire at an 85% level versus a 50% level for the novices. And it turned out in that study as well that actually the years of police service really didn't have anything to do with whether you functioned as an expert or not. It was your prior appropriate tactical training that determined if you were functioning as an expert or not. So experts will have a longer QE interval. They won't be distracted. They won't be as emotional, and their central executive function of their working memory will now actively inhibit them from looking at the unimportant things. So when novices who are anxious are looking at unimportant things, even if they have the information that those are actually unimportant, they can't keep themselves from doing it if they're anxious. So that if you told your child, I want you to look at only this, but don't look at that shiny object over there, that's the first thing that they're going to do. So this central executive is actually keeping you focused actively on what's important. So novices who have no idea of what's important or not important will just be looking all over because they don't know what an important cue is. And this is different. This is like, you know what the important cues are, you know what the unimportant cues are, but you're anxious, which makes you physiologically less able to concentrate on what you know you should be concentrating on. So that's another way that cognitive anxiety, the ventral attention network, is going to really mess you up. And
can we become better in it?
Well, sure. Through expert scenario training, you're learning what you should do to win. And so it's like cheating your natural processes of learning. So instead of taking 10 years to become an expert and hopefully even surviving that long, to get a chance to figure out what the important things are, scenario training is showing you, well, these are what the important things are. And when you go out, if you encounter these common important things, you're going to act the right way, even though, you know, we're teaching you what the right way is, not you're having to figure it out yourself and maybe dying in the process.
And if I go back to the OODA loop, can you say that it is true that if I can strengthen my orientation part by expert scenario training, is that a way to go?
100%.
Yeah.
Again, Boyd felt that the orientation phase provides the whole basis for understanding your environment to begin with, to learn what is important and what isn't. And so these scenario training studies that we're talking about, like VirTra, are short-circuiting the natural selection process of you taking 10 years to figure it out, teaching you in advance, well, when you're in this situation, these are the important things to orient to succeed in this common scenario we're showing you. And that brings us to the discussion of game theory. So how do you know what's important, and how do you know what you need to know to win in a situation? How can you be outwardly rather than inwardly focused? How can you know how others will react during a critical incident and using it to your benefit? Well, one example we used frequently was Wayne Gretzky. So Wayne Gretzky, the famous hockey player, was not the fastest, the largest, the strongest player amongst his peers, right? But he was able to read a play in order to be at the right place at the right time in order to win. So being outwardly focused generally and specifically implies that you have that understanding and that you can function in the technical aspects of the game in an automatic, reproducible manner. So if the game is a critical incident, as we were saying, your internal, let's say, technical shooting concerns, your grip, etc., will be eliminated from conscious thought and free your mind to better focus on external cues. We talked about the Bereitschaft's potential in that manner, and we talked about System 1, because System 1 is basically constantly on, setting you up to be able to function in that situation. We talked about high fidelity training. And high fidelity training is basically an important part of academy training and post-training. That training at the speed of life will be able to let you retain this important information and not forget it. And Force Science has like 10 basic principles to further that type of modern learning. So they felt that context-based and scenario training should begin, right at the beginning of anyone's training, to develop insight, motivation for learning, integrated skill development, retention, and skill, transferability. We talked about block and silo training that produced rapid gains in skill building, but was also rapidly lost almost immediately. Blending of your skills in scenario type situations called interleaving is also a key point in instruction and in practice that lets you have effective transference in real world applications. Building your skills to an automatic level, automaticity, is a key part of this. Learning as a group is very important to also improve your social and emotional intelligence. Using work groups during your training, journaling, interaction throughout a training cycle promote motivation, competition, personal insight, and change. And again, it's kind of the social and emotional learning you were talking about before.
Yeah.
And so we can see that in police training over the decades, our focus has been modified, right? So back in the 70s, when we first started kind of looking or talking about these things, we talked about flight and fight, and we thought that heart rate was related to freezing when heart rates got to be at 140 beats per minute or higher, that you'd be hyper vigilant and basically stuck in position and be a deer in the headlights and not be able to function. Since then, we found that definitely is not the case. And there's a difference between bad stress or thinking emotionally, which we call distress, which also has high heart rates, versus cognitive thinking, which we call good stress or eustress, which also has equally high heart rates, but during which time we can function at a high cognitive level. So the idea of high heart rates freezing us or keeping us from performing well or causing hypervigilance was actually not the case. And they've shown in force science studies, again, that people who are functioning under stress at optimal levels have heart rates regularly, at 200 beats per minute, just like everybody else. But also, they have increased cardiac output which the emotional people wouldn't have, and their blood pressures are constantly maintained, which is not the case in an emotional response. So we've come a long way since then. So even in the 90s, 20 years later, we saw the exercise community move away from the negative aspects of stress and how arousal, could be good. And the idea of self-regulation through breathing, mental rehearsals, when and if thinking are actually good. From the 2000s through today, we've highlighted more on increased focus, arousal, and performance in a cognitive manner. And thanks to the Quiet Eye studies and Dr. Vickers and Force Science. In 2019, there was a study by Arbel who showed that increased arousal with heart rate and high cortisol levels did affect your verbal abilities, but didn't affect your nonverbal or your technical abilities. So that's kind of when the whole idea of eustress versus distress became an important discussion. And now we see that eustress is actually critical in learning and retaining cognitive thinking. And again, the MESA study that Dr. Lewinsky and company performed was really key to this, where people had eye scanning glasses, body cameras, and heart rate monitors. You're probably familiar with this study. So it allowed people to look at what they were looking at, their eye scans, during a 5-minute scenario, which involved a car crash and which they had to respond with shots fired. And so 2 groups resulted from the study: the low scan, eye scan group, or low saccade group, and the high saccade group. The low saccade group, they both had high heart rates in the low and high performance groups, but the low saccade group performed way better than the high saccade group, like the experts versus the novices, with 85% return of fire in the experts versus only 50% in the novices. And they could see that the saccades were dramatically different in the 2 groups. And again, years of police service were not important. What was important was prior appropriate tactical training.
Yeah.
We talked about Vertra and Lon Bartel and his idea of high fidelity training, psychological fidelity, and physical fidelity, and how they both have to be as realistic as possible to make people really train at the speed of life. So experience can allow officers to view a high eustress incident as a top-down challenge rather than a bottom-up distressing threat. And you can even look at athletic training versus law enforcement training in similar ways. So Dr. Lewinsky points out, for example, that the average police recruit gets 70 hours of firearms training, standing on a range, shooting at paper, no return fire, no thought processes involved. And that 70 hours is the equivalent of maybe half a semester of what a high schooler gets on a football team in training, right? And so football, so if you're on a football team in high school, you're going to practice way more than that. And you're going to also be in practice to learn game theory, like what do I do in different situations, which police officers in block and silo situations don't get. and which you can see from our discussion they really need. So rather than high heart rates, could just inexperience and maybe test condition novelty be responsible for novice officers' anxiety and their bottom-up thinking, So are we putting the equivalent of a one-semester high school student into a professional athletics game, but here in law enforcement, where the stakes are life and death, not winning and losing. And so this gets us into the discussion a little bit of what else can we do to set the stage so that we can win versus lose. And that's the whole discussion of de-escalation. Being trained as a police officer back in 2002, when I was just freshly out of the police academy, I walked into the police shooting range, and there's a sign on the wall saying, "Be a professional gunfighter." Okay, so they were trying to teach me all the automaticity aspects of being a professional gunfighter, but they didn't teach me about what else I had to do to survive on the street. Now, to their credit, Verbal Judo, the book by George Thompson, was required reading, but we never discussed it, and it was up to us to figure out what does that mean. So as a little sidebar, that was when I had been an orthopedic surgeon for 20 years, and I had a side job in an HMO. So I would go to the HMO, and they schedule people for you to see each time. So I had to see like 30 people in a morning. So I had about 6 to 10 minutes per person. And every quarter, every 3 months, the patients would evaluate the doctors. And if you didn't get like a 90% on the patient's evaluation, you got fired. And so on my first 3 months was when I was just reading all this verbal judo stuff in the academy. Okay, so I thought I was a pretty expert surgeon. I thought I was killing it, doing all these surgeries. Everything was turning out well. My first 3-month evaluation comes around, and I got a 75, a C+. And I'm thinking, oh, what am I doing wrong? Everything's working out so well from my perspective, right? But obviously my patients didn't feel that way. So I thought, well, I better put these verbal judo recommendations to work in my medical practice. So I welcome patients to the practice. I maintained eye contact. I asked them what they expected and how I could help. I used non-medical language to explain everything. I made them feel like the most important person in the room, that I was there for them. So even though I had only 6 minutes to do it, and even though I was technically the same surgeon I was 3 months before, my next rating 3 months later was 94%. So what happened? Basically, people were willing to follow my helpful recommendations because they viewed that as being in their self-interest. So verbal judo, with its emphasis on empathy and encourage people to act in their self-interest, was one precursor to de-escalation and the realistic de-escalation course that Force Science offers. And to show that de-escalation or disengagement in certain situations are appropriate as part of being, a professional gunfighter. So it was true for me in any, interpersonal interaction, and it's true in de-escalation. So if we have, 5 more minutes to just talk about de-escalation.
Yes, of course.
In America, de-escalation has become much more important, because before this, we had only what we called the Graham factors. Graham versus Connor is an American federal ruling that said that your decision at the moment you take life-threatening action would be the determinant factors in deciding if you were right or wrong, not what led up to it, but just what happened at that moment. You were in threat of your life at that moment. You shot somebody, you protected yourself, you're okay. And you were then granted qualified immunity from criminal prosecution. So in the courts, protecting yourself going through a courtroom door versus the warrant service door proved to be a little different, because back in 2019, there was a federal case in the 10th Circuit Court, Sabalos versus Husk. And in that situation, the officers had failed to obtain any crisis intervention training and failure to use any de-escalation techniques. Their quick approach, the subject's diminished capacity to reason, and their failure to contain the subject created jeopardy that necessitated their use of force by poor pre-force decisions. So their objectively reasonable decisions became reckless when viewed in this light, and qualified immunity was denied. Soon after that, in 2022, ex-president, thank God, Joe Biden issued Executive Order 14074, and that encouraged de-escalation training through federal grants. It placed a federal ban on chokeholds and created a national registry for officer misconduct. So the message it delivered was that de-escalation, which we refer to in Force Science as persuasion and persuasion considerations, will be taken into account in the same way that the Graham versus Connor elements were used, deciding the reasonable objectiveness of a use of force encounter. And so that changed things dramatically in America. And of course, we have always used de-escalation, really, right? We have routinely used cover, concealment, barriers. We've waited for additional resources to arrive. We've maintained scene safety. We've created discretionary time. We have single officer communications and subject physical containment. We've appraised exigency and whether de-escalation could even be performed or not. But today's world, we're going to be judged, retrospectively whether we made these decisions. And so FLETC that we talked about, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, discussed this, and realizing that documenting clearly what you did, including your de-escalation attempts and your Graham factors, were really important, even after an incident. And Force Science calls that how you articulate things afterwards very important, and post-suasion, we call it, consideration. So you have persuasion, and post-suasion elements of all this that all have to be taken into account. So FLETC uses like 3 ecosystems to describe your environment and how you interact with other people. So ecosystem 1 is the officer. So the officer, that includes the totality of their mental and physical fitness, their mindset, their training, their abilities. Ecosystem 2 represents their environment. So urban, suburban, traffic density, pedestrians, potential weapons, exigency, and so forth. System 3 represents the subjects themselves. What are they thinking about? And so the 10th Circuit described problems with the officers, the scene control, and the subject's evaluation. And their immunity was denied for all those reasons. So in ecosystem one, or the officer themselves, well, we talk about officer wellness. How does their internal conditions affect their behavior and everyone else's? So they can have physical wellness or mental wellness. So mental wellness might include their psychological, their spiritual, the legal, behavioral, and social realms that are constraining them. Their physical wellness might be their physical, nutritional, and tactical wellness. So we like to think of them as elite athletes whose minds and bodies are both disciplined and ready to perform at a high level, like athletes. E2, the scene includes cover, barriers, concealment from the subject. We can manipulate those to our advantage and maximize them. And Force Science calls that the responsibility zone. So another play on words, that
Yeah, great.
that we have the responsibility to maximize it, but we have the ability to
respond.
do that while we're responding. So, and we've even seen how Colonel Boyd presented this prism through the OODA loop of how our decision-making process is now understandable. And again, he said that, well, our orientation step is shaping our overall response. Dr. Gary Klein talked about recognition prime decision-making. So how will understanding your abilities, your own E1, for example, allow you to optimize the scene, E2, and improve outcomes regarding the subject? Can the expert pre-existing schema or our OODA loop orientation stage cause relevant observations or vice versa? Well, we talked about destructive deduction and creative induction describing this process. And regarding the orientation phase, he said, remember that orientation shapes our observation, and without the context of orientation, any observation would be meaningless. And so how our subject may respond is really important. So Boyd even quoted Sun Tzu. So we've all read Sun Tzu, very popular, The Art of War. So Boyd quotes him as saying, know your enemy and yourself. In 100 battles, you will never be in peril. Seize what your adversary holds dear or values most, and then he will conform to your desires. So we assume people hold dear and value most highly their sense of dignity and self-respect. So taking measures to preserve your subject's dignity can encourage the most appropriate response from them. And then looking at the subject, we get into John Azar Dickens of Force Science and his thought, emotion, and behavior matrix. And so John Azar Dickens is another clinical psychologist who became a police officer and now is out on patrol, but also is a clinical psychologist of working in this field. So he developed this profile, which is very nicely organized on a chart he's got in their course, which categorizes thought and emotion behavior into like 8 different categories. So thoughts can be clear or contaminated. So is somebody thinking straight, or are they thinking that they're talking to someone on Mars or God, for example? Is their emotion high or low? Are they very, very agitated or not? And their behavior, is it compliant or is it non-compliant? And so you have 8 different categories of all these 3 separate groups. And they have, and that rather than going into these at great depth, which would take too long, they developed a triad of thinking called contaminated thought, high emotion, and non-compliance. They call that the trifecta of stimuli. And it's much more likely that you're going to have a violent outcome in that situation. So they say, look for that first. Does somebody, have clouded thinking? Is he amped up, and is he not listening to you? And if so, the idea of de-escalating anything is much less likely to work, and maybe you should abandon it right off the bat and proceed with appropriate force. You can set the stage for de-escalation, though, if you decide to do it, and they have a kind of a 9-step de-escalation tool.
You mean for science or?
For science.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Right, that includes things like asking yourself on the way to an incident, what are my authorities? Do I have a lawful reason for getting into the situation in the first place? Hopefully, yes. Is there exigency involved? Will I be able to stop and do something, or do I have to immediately react? What should my approach style be? Should it be covert or overt? Am I getting into an ambush, for example? What's your mission, and how urgent is it? Could you let it go and proceed some other way if you had to? Do I have intelligence or information? Do I really know that the information I've gotten is accurate, or is it just talk? How can I anticipate the actions of the subject? It's like, what if then thinking, how's he going to react? A very important point of it is called ISIN: isolate, contain, evacuate, and negotiate. And how can I do all those things? Do I have all the needed resources I need? Do I have EMS? Do I have CIT, critical incident teams? Do I have backup? Do I have rescue teams? Do I have my tools? Have I even asked for that while I'm en route? So it'll be there when I need it. Should I maneuver, or should I disengage? Is it something that my reaction can't beat their action? And Force Science has done a lot of studies showing that your reaction can never beat somebody's action in certain situations. So don't get into those situations. Can we set the stage for de-escalation? We need discretionary time, space, which includes distance barriers and cover, and also containment. So we can talk about, it's probably take too long to talk about all those separate things. And finally, are we using our verbal judo skills to try and use active listening to be able to empathize with the subject? And of course, there's a difference between sympathy and empathy, where empathy is putting yourself in their shoes. And how can you communicate with somebody if you can't look at it from their perspective, versus sympathy, which is feeling sorry for them. And so feeling sorry for them is definitely optional, but empathy is kind of mandatory if you're going to try and convince them to do anything. So a psychologist named Vecchi described the behavioral influence stairway model, or BISM, and the 5 steps there, which should be done in sequence always, are contacting the suspect. And there, it should be single officer communication to not confuse people, demonstrating empathy, which we just talked about. And we remember, of course, that verbal communication is only 6% words. So our body language is really important in that situation. Developing rapport. So are there any vanilla topics you can find common ground on? Like, gee, that's a nice truck you're sitting in.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say something like, gee, how's the automatic switch in your Glock working for you? The next one would be to develop directive communication. So here you're trying to persuade them to do what you want. So you could use different types of communications: logical, emotional, characterological. Your mother would want you to do this, for example. And finally, trying to influence behavioral changes. And so discretionary time, which we've just mentioned before, was necessary to really, ascend the stairway. So we can't skip any steps in the stairway, and spending more rather than less time on each step is good if you think you haven't accomplished your goal. So you have to make an active listening connection. And going about that is probably beyond the scope of our discussion. But also, how do you incorporate all these principles into your written and oral reporting afterwards that, as we mentioned, Force Science calls post-suasion considerations. And they make like 32 recommendations of what you should think about. But to summarize them, try to incorporate all of the Force Science, persuasion, and FLETC, SURF, or Graham factors into your reporting, written and verbal. And always consider to try and obtain 2 sleep cycles before having a verbal report, so you can really remember everything as well as possible. So you're painting a picture, make it a masterpiece.
Yeah, great.
And things to think about.
So we come a long way from talking about becoming a police officer, a unified theory of stress with all the physiological mechanisms, about decision making, the OODA loop, till de-escalation training. I have one more question. I have 2 more questions, 2 short questions, if I may.
Sure.
And the first question is, I used a concept called OODA-proof training. I presented it at the police academy a month ago. And I have the feeling that the OODA loop can be used as a simple acronym, but you can, as you did in this podcast, you can bring under that umbrella. You can use all the modern science. Is that true? Is the OODA loop so good?
Correct, and that's why FLETC chose it as a model to be able to frame these important discussions, and through which Boyd uses even Sun Tzu to help us understand these basic psychological principles. So really, the OODA loop is a great foundation for discussion of modern psychological learning and success versus failure in law enforcement training.
Yeah, great. And I also want to show the people something, and that is this. I'm not sure if you can see it right now.
Yes, my book.
Yeah, so you have written a book called the Law Enforcement Medical Encyclopedia, Navigating Medical Challenge in the Dangerous World. Can you, for who is that book? And
well, thank you for bringing that up. I wrote this book about a year ago after several years of writing it. Over my law enforcement career, I've done a lot of medical teaching of field medical care related problems, and these developed into 17 separate discussions or chapters in my book. One of the chapters, for example, is actually making an expert. How do we make expert decisions? So the kinds of things we've been talking about, we go over in that chapter, but there are several other chapters of importance to law enforcement and to everyone else, actually. So things like drug-related problems, suicide in police areas, WMD, which is actually, I think, a very increasing problem that we will be seeing again in the near future, unfortunately. Problems with sight, problems with hearing. What about self-aid, buddy aid, which is usually the first thing we talk about when we're talking to the police? What are the best nutritional recommendations? How do we organize physical training programs? And although I wrote it originally for law enforcement, it also, I think, is very important for the medical community because they really never learn any of these field medical care related problems, but yet they're expected to deal with them.
Yeah.
And the third group is just the concerned citizen. So here we hear about all these problems surrounding us and we have generalized fear about it. So was COVID-19 a bioweapon, for example, or the Israeli border guards that were killed by Hamas with chemical weapons? What happened there? Or people are thinking of dropping a dirty bomb on our city. What's a dirty bomb? So we get very anxious about all these things, but without any understanding of what actually the problem is or what we can do about it. We have just vague cognitive anxiety. So by reading the book, the general population can also get a lot of important lifestyle information that'll, I think, help them generally. So it's those three audiences.
When is the white paper coming out?
The white paper has been written, and as soon as Force Science feels like publishing it somehow through them, they will do it, and it would hopefully be in the near future. And I don't want to be too bossy trying to nag them on a regular basis about it, but I am.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Did I forget to ask you anything?
That's a tough question. My lawyers tell me never to answer a question like that.
Okay. Okay. Well, I enjoyed this, and I will say goodbye to the listeners, and then I will say goodbye to you off the record. Is that okay?
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, it's the same. So thank you for listening to this great conversation. I hope you learned a lot of it, and till the next time. Bye bye.